Every single morning for 2 straight years, 7-year-old Marguerite Kowalczyk ran past the school buses, past her own classmates, and threw her arms around an elderly janitor before she even set foot in her classroom. And not one teacher, not one parent, thought to ask why, until the morning she found him collapsed on the gymnasium floor and discovered the secret he'd been carrying alone for over a decade. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness and second chances, take a moment to like this video, drop a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Wisdom Storyhouse, because this story is about to remind you that the quietest people often carry the heaviest, most beautiful stories. The janitor's name was Cornelius Abernathy, 71 years old, a widower who had worked at Elmbrook Elementary for nearly 14 years, ever since retiring from a long career as a machinist and finding the silence of an empty house unbearable after his wife's passing. He was a familiar fixture around the building, pushing his cart of cleaning supplies through the hallways before the first bell, mopping the cafeteria floors during lunch, always polite, always quiet, the kind of man most students and staff acknowledged with a passing nod but rarely engaged beyond that. Most children barely noticed him at all, the way adults performing invisible, essential work often go unnoticed by busy young minds preoccupied with their own small worlds. Marguerite was different, and had been from her very first week at Elmbrook, back when she was 5 years old and starting kindergarten in a school where she knew absolutely no one. She was a naturally observant child, quieter than most of her classmates, and on that very first day, overwhelmed by the noise and newness of everything around her, she'd wandered slightly away from her line during a hallway transition and found herself standing beside Cornelius as he wiped down a water fountain. He'd knelt down to her level, asked gently if she was lost, and walk her back to her classroom himself, speaking to her the entire way in a calm, unhurried voice that had somehow made the enormous, frightening building feel smaller and safer. From that day forward, Marguerite made it her personal ritual to find Cornelius each morning before class, running to wherever he happened to be working and wrapping her small arms around his waist in a quick, enthusiastic hug before continuing on to her classroom. Cornelius, initially surprised by the persistence of this small routine, came to genuinely treasure it, often admitting to the school's front office secretary, a woman named Philippa Hendricks who'd worked alongside him for years, that Marguerite's morning hug had become the single brightest moment of his entire day, every single day, without exception. What none of the staff or students fully understood, because Cornelius had never once mentioned it to anyone at the school, was that he was quietly struggling with a serious heart condition, diagnosed nearly 8 years earlier, one that required careful management and medication he'd been increasingly unable to afford on his modest janitorial salary and even more modest pension. He lived alone in a small rented apartment on the edge of town, having sold his and his late wife's house years earlier to cover mounting medical costs, and he'd made peace, in his own private way, with the likelihood that he would simply keep working for as long as his body allowed, without burdening anyone around him with the details of his declining health. Marguerite, over her 2 years at the school, had grown from a shy kindergartner into a more confident second grader, but her morning ritual with Cornelius never wavered, rain or shine, through school assemblies and standardized testing weeks and every ordinary Tuesday in between. Her parents, Wendell and Artily Kowalczyk, had heard about the friendship from Marguerite's frequent dinner table stories about Mr. Cornelius, and while they found it sweet, they hadn't given it much deeper thought beyond appreciating that their daughter had found comfort in an unlikely, gentle friendship within an intimidating new environment. The morning everything changed began like any other. Marguerite arrived at school slightly earlier than usual because her father had an early work meeting, and finding the hallway still mostly empty, she went looking for Cornelius in his usual early spots, eventually making her way toward the gymnasium where he sometimes prepared the floor before morning assemblies. She pushed open the heavy gymnasium door and found him lying motionless on the polished wood floor, his cart of supplies overturned beside him, his face pale in a way that immediately terrified her. Marguerite, despite her age, didn't freeze the way many children might have. She ran, as fast as her small legs could carry her, back toward the front office, screaming for help the entire way, her voice carrying with an urgency that brought Philippa Hendricks and the school's principal, a composed but immediately alarmed woman named Rosalind Marchetti, running toward the gymnasium within seconds. Emergency services were called immediately, and Cornelius, who had suffered a serious cardiac event, was rushed to the hospital in critical but stable condition, his life almost certainly saved by the fact that Marguerite had found him within minutes rather than the hour or more that might have passed before anyone else discovered him in that rarely visited corner of the building so early in the morning. If this story is touching your heart right now, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment sharing your thoughts, because what happens next reminds us that small, consistent kindness can quietly save a life long before anyone realizes it happening. In the chaos and worry that followed, As hospital staff worked to stabilize Cornelius and the school administration scrambled to understand what had happened, the full picture of his circumstances began slowly emerging. A hospital social worker, reviewing his case and financial situation as part of standard intake procedure, discovered that Cornelius had been rationing his heart medication for months, taking half doses to stretch his limited supply further, silently gambling with his own health rather than asking his employer or anyone else for the help he desperately needed. When this information reached Principal Marchetti through the hospital's outreach coordinator, who had contacted the school seeking any emergency contact information Cornelius might have listed, she was horrified to learn that a man who had quietly served their school community for 14 years had been suffering in such dangerous silence, worried, as he later admitted from his hospital bed, that revealing his condition might cost him the job that gave his life structure and purpose since his wife's death. Marguerite, meanwhile, visited Cornelius in the hospital as soon as her parents could arrange it, walking into his room with the same fearless directness that had carried her down that gymnasium hallway screaming for help. She climbed carefully onto the edge of his hospital bed, hugged him gently around his shoulders exactly as she did every school morning, and told him plainly that she'd been very scared but that she was glad the doctors were helping him get better. Cornelius, overwhelmed with emotion in a way he rarely allowed himself to express, held the small girl's hand and told her, his voice unsteady, that her morning hugs had kept him going through more difficult days than she could possibly understand, and that finding him that morning had likely saved his life in more ways than one. Wendell and Artely Kowalczyk, learning the full extent of what Cornelius had been quietly enduring, found themselves deeply moved by the realization that this gentle man who had shown their daughter such consistent kindness had been struggling entirely alone, without a support system to catch him the way he'd unknowingly been catching Marguerite's small heart every morning for 2 years. They organized, alongside Principal Marchetti and Felipa Hendricks, a community fundraiser through the school, initially intended simply to help cover Cornelius's mounting medical bills, but which quickly grew into something considerably larger as word spread through the tight-knit school community about the janitor who had quietly touched so many lives without anyone fully realizing it. Before this story ends, if it moved you even a little, please comment the word hug below, because sometimes the smallest daily ritual carries far more weight and meaning than any of us realize until the moment it nearly disappears. Parents who had barely acknowledged Cornelius beyond a passing hallway greeting suddenly recalled small kindnesses he'd shown their own children over the years, quiet moments of patience and attention that had gone entirely unnoticed until his absence made his presence undeniably clear. The fundraiser, initially hoping to raise a modest sum toward medical expenses, ultimately collected enough to cover his treatment entirely, establish a small emergency fund for his ongoing care, and, at the insistence of the school board once they learned the full story, formally revised the district's employee health benefits to ensure no other staff member would ever again feel forced into rationing life-saving medication out of fear or financial desperation. Cornelius recovered steadily over the following months, and when he finally returned to Elmbrook Elementary on modified hours per his doctor's recommendation, the entire school gathered in the very gymnasium where Marguerite had found him, transforming what had once been the site of near tragedy into a celebration of his return. Marguerite, now firmly established as something of a local legend among her classmates for what she'd done, ran across that same gymnasium floor exactly as she had every morning for 2 years, and wrapped her arms around Cornelius one more time, this time in front of an entire cheering assembly of students, teachers, and parents who finally understood the quiet, essential value of the man they'd walked past for so many years without truly seeing. Cornelius continued working at Elmbrook for 3 more years after his recovery, his health carefully monitored and properly managed, his morning routine with Marguerite continuing faithfully until she graduated to middle school, at which point she made a point of visiting him during every school break, unwilling to let the friendship fade simply because their daily paths no longer crossed. He often told anyone who asked that a small girl's simple, unwavering habit of showing up with open arms every single morning had done more to sustain him through his hardest years than he could ever properly repay, proof that the quietest, most consistent forms of kindness often carry a weight and power that even the person offering them rarely recognizes until it's needed most.